You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
It's the little kid that said I fooled him because I didn't wear any.
Any what? Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan. I'm here with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
How are you today?
I thought for sure I caught you that time.
I know.
I thought I did. But, the problem is that the recording device beeps.
No, the problem is I'm trained in behavioral observations. I watch you being sneaky.
I need to figure out a way to make it not beep. And then you wouldn't get the auditory cue.
You hope.
I hope.
There are visual cues that go along with that.
We were having a conversation. It was kind of funny, and I wanted to try and get some of it on record, but you were too smart.
That's a problem I've suffered from my entire life.
That you're too smart? Yeah. So, do you have clean undergarments on?
I'm not sharing that information.
You're not sharing it?
Yeah.
Well, it's probably too late for your parents to feel like they raised you.
Oh, no, those voices are still in my head.
They're in your head.
Yeah.
But your parents aren't still telling you that.
Well, they're dead.
Well, they're telling you that because I guess it's still in your head.
They're still in my head, yeah. I still hear them say things like, you're too stupid to go to college.
Yeah. So I was expelled from high school the last semester of my senior year for a number of reasons that I feel like are not correct. A teacher said that I assaulted him, which is not true. I didn't assault him.
Sometimes your presence is just assaulting.
Yes, because I'm so intimidating. People say, "Oh, you're so intimidating."
I was expelled in grade school because I pulled a knife on a kid.
Well, now that I could understand.
Yeah.
You actually did it.
I actually did it.
Yeah.
And he understood.
Yeah. And he didn't do that again.
He did not.
Except for you didn't come back to school.
For 2 or 3 days.
Yeah. Well, that's what happened to me. So I got it. And the principal was a close talker and a spitter.
Oh, yeah.
And so he was in my face telling me what a delinquent I was and how I would never go to college and I would never get a full-time job. I'd never be a meaningful member of society.
Yes.
And, he was absolutely right because I've never done any of those things.
I used to have a colleague when I was teaching school that was a somewhat diminutive man who learned all of these nonverbal techniques to establish himself in conversation. And he would get inside your personal space really close and drop his voice register low to make you lean in to hear him. And he would talk quietly to you. He'd like back you into a corner if you were in a party or something so that you were looking into the room, but this person was not. And they were having a private conversation with you. And it used to bother me because he was always in my space. And I'd try to move away, and he'd unconsciously move forward. And I'd move away, and he'd move forward. And it was part of that kinesthetic dance of conversation. So one day, he leaned in to talk to me, and I just licked the end of his nose. And he jumped back. He's like, what? I said, don't get that close to me. Yeah.
I bet he never did that again.
No, actually, I don't think he has. Yeah.
Were you taking acid at the time?
No.
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 Yeah, because
but that does lead us to this conversation. It sounds as if I was.
Yeah. I mean, the story would have been really interesting if you had said yes.
Yes, but it wouldn't have been accurate.
But it wouldn't have been accurate, yeah. So we've talked about this before, and
we did a podcast several months ago on this topic.
And apparently you liked it so much.
No, never make assumptions. You know what they say about that.
Yeah.
But because you called my attention to this topic, and because several people who listened to the podcast said they found it to be of interest, I was more aware when this article came across my desk and said, wait a minute, I need to send this to Mike. Yeah. So I sent it back to you.
Yeah. And so you sent this topic to me. And this brings me to something that's in my head.
Oh, our listeners could send topics to us, yes.
And this is bad radio. But you sent me another thing that I couldn't understand what it was about. But we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
that should be an experience with which you are familiar.
That you sent me something that I couldn't understand.
Exactly.
Yeah, but so you sent me a follow-up article to. We had done a podcast, and the title was "Is Acid the New Prozac?" And the fundamental underpinning of that was that there is a lot of research which is being done with psychedelic molecules and their ability to be used therapeutically in the treatment of psychiatric disorders.
Yeah, finally it's coming out of the shadows. The government war on drugs and the whole reefer madness concept.
So reefer madness comes from Paul Azinger, who was the first drug czar, who people may not know this, but originally King George required 20% of all land grants to be planted in hemp.
Because they made rope for
Because they made
ships.
rope. They had the largest naval fleet in the world.
Yeah.
And so the people who were settling in the New World didn't want to grow hemp because it was of no value to them, but they grew it because the crown required them to do so.
Right.
But because hemp was an invasive species, it didn't have any natural enemies here in the United States, there was a period of time from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains, from the very tip of New England all the way down to Atlanta, where hemp grew
like
wild.
A country song.
Yeah, I know. And hemp was just the predominant. There was a part of a book that Paul Azinger wrote where he was driving over a bridge over the Potomac back when you could stop and it wouldn't cause a traffic jam. And he said that as far as he could see in every direction, all he could see was marijuana. Growing wild. And so part of what he did was he called out the National Guard, and they walked shoulder to shoulder and just cut down hemp plants and burned them, and everybody got high. But that was one thing that they did, which was very effective at reducing the amount of hemp that grew naturally on the eastern seaboard. But the second thing that he did was that he really promoted these kind of social programs to make drugs seem diabolical. And so prior to that, there was no negative inferences. I mean, back in the Civil War days, you could buy heroin and opium out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog.
And laudanum. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, and so there was no negative connotation associated with drugs of any kind at that point. And so it was really the promotional programs of the 1900s that linked the drug usage to immigrant populations that really caused the negative connotation that we associate with drugs today.
Yeah, and then the system didn't learn from the constitutional amendments to prohibit alcohol, and this subsequent constitutional amendment to allow alcohol consumption again. They didn't learn. And so the myth about drug use became so pervasive in it's totally corrupt and damaging and destructive of society that the government started spending millions and millions and millions of dollars in enforcement and imprisonment. We have more people in prison than any democracy in the world.
No kidding.
And the cost to us societally, in terms of making all that stuff illegal, has become entrenched, and the police forces have become addicted to the money that they get and the machinery that they get from the government in pursuit of destroying the drug trade. It's just really, really has been a mistake.
And, we don't have to dive deeply into the weeds of this, but the first law on the books that prohibited drugs in the United States was 1904. And every law between 1904 and 1972 that was written in the United States to prohibit drugs was to control some immigrant population.
Yes.
And that's a fact, and that's not something that I think is even surprising to people. But it was 1972, the Controlled Substances Act, that created the schedule of drugs that we are now familiar with. That was the first law in the United States that didn't have anything to do with controlling an immigrant population that had to do with drugs.
I did not know any of that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that information.
Well, and so the point being that the current philosophy that we adhere to concerning drugs is really one of persuasion that had to do with the federal government trying to control immigrant populations, and not because they thought drugs were bad.
But it's like a weed; it grows.
Yes.
I have talked to several DEA agents who would spend time explaining to me about the danger of gateway drugs, and that I just didn't understand that even though there's no scientific proof that this particular substance was in and of itself addictive and destructive, it causes an experimentation mentality that leads people to look for different highs in different ways from different substances that are destructive and addictive. And so the only solution is shut it all down, put everybody in jail.
And so we're 10 minutes in, and I want to make a disclaimer.
Sorry. Yeah.
And say that if you've only listened to the first 10 minutes and then you've jumped out, then you probably have the impression that we are condoning drug use, which we are not. And we are not trying to say that addiction to an opiate or any other drug is not self-destructive to a person's life.
No,
what we are saying is
that, at all.
that there is a philosophy that has grown up around drugs in Western culture that we are asking people to evaluate more critically.
Legalize it, tax it, decriminalize it, treat it. Don't put people in prison because they expose themselves to it. And reinvest that money that's going into incarceration and enforcement, reinvest that money into treatment, hospitalization, education. It's a philosophical orientation. That's all. We're not advocating drug consumption, drug consumerism.
Absolutely.
We're not suggesting people ought to go play with these substances. But what we are saying is there's more and more research coming out now that has been limited and restricted by the federal government in their efforts to squelch all responses to drug curiosity scientifically, not drug curiosity socially in terms of usage. And now they're starting to find value in a couple of drugs that were totally prohibited, even in research domains, since the Nixon administration, when Nixon came out and said Timothy Leary is the most dangerous man in America. And so now, because there are some phenomenal new data points, some new information that's coming out about these two drugs, that is opening up the whole research market internationally. Scientists are being able to study it with study populations in confined, restricted ways to see if there are benefits for addiction, for sleep disruption, for depression, for suicidality that we can find and legitimize and legalize and make available to people who would then lead less disturbed and destructive lives.
And so the drugs specifically that we are talking about today and that will be on the article that I'll post in the notes are psilocybin, which is the psychoactive ingredient in mushrooms, and MDMA, which is ecstasy. And
so I was waiting for you to say those because I can't pronounce that first one.
Okay. But I don't believe that. You are a wordsmith. So you can pronounce anything.
Maybe if I take a hit of psilocybin, I'll be able to.
You probably could. But we're trying to lay the foundation for why it is that we have such a negative connotation associated with drugs, because I really believe that the United States needs to evaluate what our history with drugs were. So from 1776, the founding of the nation, until 1904, there was never any question about drugs or who could use them or anything else. It wasn't a part of the consciousness. When we completed the Transcontinental Railroad, and there were a bunch of Asian immigrants who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, they ended up in San Francisco, and they all migrated towards opium dens because that was a part of of their culture.
Yeah.
And people looked around and said, hey, these Asians are doing drugs and raping our women, and we don't like it, and so we want them gone. And so the 1904 Act to prohibit the incorporation of opium into tinctures and other medications of the time was a way of trying to make these Asian immigrants immigrate back to their home countries. So that was the first attempt to try and control an immigrant population through a drug law, and every drug law that was on the books from 1904 until 1972 was in pursuit of trying to control some immigrant population.
But it overlooks or refuses to look at the law of supply and demand.
Mm-hmm.
It's about societal regulation. The people in power make the determination of what behaviors they support, and then they structure the laws in support of the behaviors that they support.
And the average person, they're just
trying to get along.
Yeah, they're not even thinking about it. So let's go to our break, and we'll come back and talk more about the psilocybin.
Okay.
Okay.
One of the reasons that I want to participate in this show is because it gives me an opportunity to clinically review my understanding of what therapy is and how it works, especially for the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So my hope is that we will find conversations that broaden my understanding of that.
And my hope is that we do that in a way that is useful but also entertaining for people, so that they want to listen, not only because they're getting good psychology information, but because they just enjoy the show.
Easy listening with an informational twist. So
that's a new tagline.
They're not sitting there going, huh?
Easy listening with an informational twist.
I'm really good at this. I'm a professional.
You're a professional. If it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike. Okay, we're back. And so what a lot of people probably don't know, and actually there would be no way for you to know this, is before Timothy Leary in the early 60s, all research that was being conducted on molecules to try and treat psychiatric issues were psychedelic. And so we found certain substances like imipramine and things like this that seemed to have a psychoactive effect, but nobody believed that those were very effective. And so, and the original imipramine, I believe, was actually a part of the dye that was used to dye blue jeans. And so it was kind of ironic. And if that's, there was a drug that was a dye in blue jeans that was actually used to treat psychiatric disorders that was found coincidentally. But all of the research that was being done on real effective treatments for psychiatric diagnoses were either lysergic acid diethylamide, which is LSD, or psilocybin. There were some other research on DMT, which is the psychoactive ingredient that is in certain barks of trees, and then there are certain frogs which have psychoactive properties in the mucous membranes of their skin. But all of this research was being done with these psychedelics. Timothy Leary comes along and he's doing this research at Harvard, and he really saw himself as a cult of personality. He really didn't care about the scientific research he was doing. He just wanted to be seen as a guru. And one of the things that he did was during the Johnson administration was a very, very vocal advocate of people protesting the war, which was inconvenient for the Johnson administration. And so they went out and engaged in a campaign to discredit Timothy Leary, and as a part of that, they quashed all of the research that had been done up to that point in the investigation of psychedelic compounds. And because there were no internets, once the United States government took all of that literature out of circulation, it ceased to exist. And so there were 2 universities that were allowed to continue that research. One was Johns Hopkins on the East Coast. The other one was Stanford on the West Coast. They were, and it may not have been Stanford, but there was one university in California, I think it was Stanford, that were allowed to continue this research. And now today, because of the relaxation,
they were allowed to continue, but it was a severely restricted amount of research
they couldn't publicize it. They couldn't publicize it.
And they were limited in their ability to construct scientific protocols for the research.
Because they had to use certain strains of of the molecules.
So when we're talking about doing this research and that there are new studies coming out, we're talking about scientifically validated and replicable studies.
Right.
The advantage of a scientific study is you have discrete populations that consume the materials.
Mm-hmm.
The responses to that are tabulated and published. And then other universities can create the same sample population, provide the same amount of the substance, and should get the same behavioral results. When they do, then that's a validated, peer-reviewed scientific study. This isn't just something somebody dreamed up and published on the internet as a blog and said, hey, let's do this, this will work. It's got to be legitimate science.
But it's because of the relaxation of the reluctance in the public that has allowed this to happen. So
and the demand. In these 2 research protocols, the whole ketamine thing about treatment for depression evolved out of this data, which is so limited. And so now you can get this treatment as a treatment for severe chronic depression if you go to a physician's office and get this shot and stay there.
Right.
So they can monitor you physiologically to make sure you're not going to have a stroke or a heart attack or what have you. And they find that for many of those severely resistant depressive individuals, there's a beneficial gain, there's a relief, there's progress when nothing else ever worked.
And so some of that came out of the MK Ultra experimentation that the United States government did with lysergic acid diethylamide. They actually were using that as a mind control kind of a procedure. But what they found was that if you administered large doses of this to individuals who had substance abuse issues, that they were magically healed after one application. And so then Johns Hopkins continued that research, and ketamine is a very powerful tranquilizer that does have hallucinogenic properties, and they developed that into a nasal spray that Johnson & Johnson now markets. And yes, you have to go to the doctor's office and they give you a dose of that, and then you have to stay there, so you're not going home high. But yes, they have found that it has remarkable ability in just a few doses to really
in
be
this
able
chronic,
to
severe population.
And so that leads us to believe that
there
it
might
has
be other things.
Yes. Yeah.
There might be more than we understood.
Right. And so because the public is now more willing to tolerate this kind of thing, it's now beginning to get back into mainstream publication. But so for everybody who's out there saying, oh, you know, our nation's going to hell because we're legalizing marijuana and we're talking about letting people out of prison. Well, guess what? If we figure out ways of being able to treat psychiatric disorders more effectively because of this, that might not be a bad thing.
So again, let's do a disclaimer.
Yeah, okay.
We are not promoting drug experimentation or drug use.
And let me say, I am a recovering person. I'm still a recovering. I'm not going to go out and do drugs because we're talking about this. There's a difference between addiction and therapeutic value.
There also are differences that become available when government restriction and supervision of research projects is expanded, when they take their thumb off the speedometer. So we're saying there is new, encouraging, hopeful research in a direction that they've not been allowed to go that seems beneficial. And we're excited about that proposition, but we want it done carefully, under guidelines that are internationally respected guidelines for scientific research, and without the government thumb on it in terms of what pieces of that could be acceptable or beneficial. Let's put the information out there. Let's let people find out what works, and let's find a new way forward so that we're not criminalizing and incarcerating large numbers of people who do these things that we don't find socially acceptable.
But I think we also have to recognize that this isn't a new idea.
No.
So MDMA, or ecstasy, prior to 1972 in the Scheduled Controlled Substances Act, was routinely used as an adjunct to therapy, especially with couples in marriage counseling.
Yeah, you go to the marriage counselor's office and get high.
Well, I mean,
have a dream or a trip, and but have it monitored and supervised.
So one of the unique properties, and MDMA is somewhat unique. It's not really a hallucinogen. It's not really a stimulant, but it has the qualities of both. And so, especially in California, the therapeutic community, marriage and family therapists there, used this drug as an adjunct, and oftentimes even the therapist would take some MDMA, and people felt much more connected to one another. Their levels of oxytocin, the hormone in your system that makes you feel proactively connected, pro-socially connected to other individuals, is just off the roof when you're taking MDMA. So much so that when the schedule came out and MDMA was on Schedule 1, which meant that it had no medicinal value, there was actually a petition drive in California by the marriage and family therapeutic community there to exclude MDMA, or at least exclude it for their therapeutic purposes, because they had an entire regime, a long-standing treatment protocol that existed with the use of MDMA. This isn't the first time that anybody's thought of using these chemicals in a therapeutic way or had found therapeutic value in them.
No, but there is upheaval in the United States when a significant proportion of the population wants to legalize access to recreational marijuana. And a number of states, 13 I believe, have gone along with that and legalized it. Other states have said, well, no, we're not ready to legalize it for recreational use, but we will legalize it for medicinal use. And then there are still some states that say, well, no, we're not going to go there. But in the last administration, the first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was a firm believer in the old school ideology. And he said, marijuana will never come off of Schedule 1. We will not allow it to become legal. And even if states legalize it, we will pursue you with the federal banking laws. So that whatever money you make from it, you can't put in the bank, you can't pay with a check, you can't write a check. So, we're not going to enable this through our other methods of leverage. And so that hasn't been approached in the new administration, and in the subsequent Barr administration. I don't know what their position was, but I know Jeff Sessions specifically said, no, we're not going there.
I don't think that there was a Democratic candidate who didn't have in his platform a plank that didn't say we would be willing to legalize marijuana. And the reason is because the SEC, so the Security and Exchange Commission, has been saying for a decade now, for all of the time, if you're going to use it as medicinal, right? So California has had medicinal marijuana as a part of its protocol for, whatever it is, 15, 20, 18 years. I don't know. But if you're going to use it as medicinal, then that's one thing. If you're going to say it's recreationally legal, well, now none of those businesses can put their money in a bank, because if the bank sends that money across a state line, now that's federal money laundering. And so it's illegal, and the SEC says we can't control this. You can't have these businesses unbanked. That just doesn't make any sense. And so the SEC has been begging for Congress to act to normalize the commercial laws so that these businesses can get banked, and there's
simply
a growing...
means they have to take it off Schedule 1.
Right.
I mean, they could do that.
They could do that.
They haven't done it because there's an entrenched group that is in control that says, no, we're not ready.
I'm assuming that you could do it with an executive order, but you certainly could do it with an act of Congress.
I don't know if that's true. I think it takes an act of Congress.
Well, it may be. It may be. But I don't know. I don't know what the intricacies are.
We're getting far afield
Yes,
from
yes.
the fact that there is encouraging and exciting research that's finally becoming more mainstream,
Right.
and more acceptable and legal, that potentiates growth in the field for the treatment of serious psychological issues. And so that's very exciting to us.
And, here's I'm looking for the reference. Okay, I'm not going to find it. But anyway, in the article that I will post in the show notes here, there's a couple of things. Number one is that they have links. This is from the New York Times, so you can say that that's a liberal rag, whatever. But the references that they have in this article point to actual research studies, just as you said. And one of the foremost institutions of research in the area of psychedelics is Johns Hopkins. I can't imagine a better pedigree than that for saying that this is real stuff. This isn't like the back of Rolling Stone magazine. Yeah. I mean, we're not talking about getting your, clerical degree in the back of Rolling Stone magazine. I mean,
and we're not talking about album notes on the back of the Rolling Stone. Yeah.
This is real stuff, and it is well researched and well replicatable. And if you have a question, this article also references Michael Pollan's book, which, if you know anything about Michael Pollan, he's a real guy. I mean, he's a legitimate, right?
I don't know.
Oh, well, you've never read a Michael Pollan book?
I don't think I have.
Well, but he's an actual author and a very well-respected author, I think, in most areas. And his book, How to Change Your Mind, if you've never exposed yourself to this subject before, is a great place for people to start. It's got a ton of information that talks about the stuff that we've talked about here in the show today, and it's a really easy read, and I think it's extremely persuasive in making the argument. And again, I'm not encouraging anybody to go do drugs.
Never.
I'm encouraging people to be flexible in the way that they think about these molecules, and if there is potential for people to be able to get treated in a way that is beneficial to them, then we need to be open to that being something that we explore.
Yes. My issue is that, and then additionally, I have issues with the societal regulation leverage of the power system that I think has led us in the wrong direction of incarcerating too many of our citizens for things that we've defined as crimes that I think shouldn't be defined as crimes.
And I agree 100%. If we let everybody who's in prison out of prison for non-violent drug-related crimes, our society would not crumble.
But we couldn't do that unless we also made treatment facilities available that were not criminalized, and still could give messages saying we don't support this. We don't support speeding. People speed.
Exactly.
And if you speed and you kill somebody, then there's a whole different deal than if you speed and have to get a fine.
If you were willing to normalize the marijuana laws, that doesn't mean you're giving permission for people to drive high.
No.
We don't give permission for people to drive drunk, but alcohol's still available.
And there's societal pressure and leverage that has changed that in my lifetime to where it's not socially acceptable. People don't go wink, wink, nod, nod, oh, well, he was just drunk. They say, put him away, he's a drunk driver, he hurts people, it's bad. That's changed culturally. Smoking, addiction to smoking has changed in my lifetime.
Right.
These addictions could also change.
Absolutely. Okay, so hopefully that is informative for people, and if it's sparked, some kind of question or thinking inside you want to get a hold of us, you can contact the show at psychwithmike.com. You can get us on Facebook at Psych with Mike, on Twitter at Psych with Mike, and on TikTok at Psych with Mike. The music that is in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.